Imagine this. You are standing among people who seem content with the surface of things. Their words skim over shallow waters, gossip, television, the comfort of well-worn jokes. They laugh easily. They nod in agreement. They speak of things designed to pass the time, not deepen it. And you step forward, gently, not out of pride, but out of longing, offering a thought that reaches further, asking a question that breathes. But it lands nowhere. There is a pause, a silence not of awe, but of discomfort. Eyes dart. Someone coughs. The conversation shifts. And in that moment, you feel yourself disappear. Not physically, but existentially, as though who you truly are has no place to rest in that room. A quiet decision follows. Maybe it's better to say nothing. It is a decision not of cowardice, but of fatigue. The fatigue of trying to connect in a world that listens only to echoes of itself. This silence, then, becomes not just absence of speech, but absence of recognition. And that, I would argue, is a kind of spiritual starvation. Intelligence real, living, breathing intelligence is not the glittering prize our culture pretends it is. It is not medals or test scores or the ability to win an argument. It is the capacity to perceive contradiction without fleeing it. It is the gift or burden of seeing past illusion, of piercing the surface in search of what is real. And the more you see, the more difficult it becomes to belong. Because to belong, in today's world, often means to submit to the superficial, to nod when you feel dissonance, to smile when you sense despair beneath the mask of someone's laughter. And the truly intelligent, those who do not merely accumulate information, but feel compelled to seek truth, they are the ones who become strangers in their own communities. Not because they choose exile, but because they speak a language that is no longer taught. What we encounter here is not merely intellectual loneliness, but what I have called existential isolation, the kind that arises not from being alone, but from being unseen, unmirrored. You are surrounded by faces, but none reflect the self you carry inside. In fact, the more your thoughts move against the current, the more invisible you become. This, I believe, is not just a sociological phenomenon, it is a symptom of a society that fears depth. And why does society fear depth? Because to go deep is to feel, and to feel, in a world obsessed with distraction and consumption, is an act of rebellion. It means being vulnerable to suffering, yes, but also to joy, to beauty, to meaning. And those things cannot be monetized, cannot be easily controlled, cannot be explained away by a hashtag or an algorithm. So when you speak truth, not as a weapon, but as an offering, and it is met with discomfort, that is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It is a mirror of a collective unconsciousness that has grown too afraid to feel. And yet, the tragedy is this: the thinker does not wish to dominate, only to share. Not to impress, but to connect. What we long for is not applause, but understanding. Not an audience, but a witness. The problem is not intelligence. The problem is that the world no longer knows what to do with it. Not the kind that questions, that suffers, that wonders. In a culture built on speed and spectacle, to slow down and truly ask, what is real becomes an act of disobedience. And so we remain not superior, not above, but apart. Still human, still needing touch, conversation, communion, but finding again and again that our truths are met with silence or resistance, or worse, polite dismissal, the kind that leaves no mark, but erodes you from within. What begins as isolation turns into resignation, and what once was a desire to share becomes a habit of withholding, not because you have nothing to say, but because saying it hurts more than silence. And yet something in you refuses to shut down completely, because somewhere beneath the fatigue, beneath the ache of being misunderstood, there is still the hope, however small, that there is someone, somewhere, who hears the question in your voice and doesn't look away. That is why, even in exile, we keep seeking. Because in seeking, we resist the lie that connection is no longer possible. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the act of naming this loneliness, of bringing it into the light, we begin to stitch the first thread of something different. Not a return to the crowd, but the slow, steady building of a bridge from one aware soul to another. The capacity for thought, real as penetrating thought, is not merely a function of the intellect. It is, at its root, a function of love. Not romantic love, but the kind of love that seeks to unite with reality, to embrace truth even when it is uncomfortable, disorienting, or lonely. And yet, in a society that trains us to escape discomfort at all costs, the act of truly seeing and desiring to see becomes a threat rather than a virtue. The intelligent person, in this sense, is not someone who simply knows more, but one who cannot help but question what others accept. They look at the spectacle of life, the roles, the performances, the unquestioned rituals, and they feel estranged, not because they wish to be different, but because they can no longer pretend. Their eyes are not designed to look away. To be intelligent in such a world is to carry a lens, not a glamorous one, but one that magnifies contradiction, exposes the cracks in our collective illusions, and strips away the polish until all that remains is the bare, unresolved tension of existence. Most people, understandably, avoid that tension. They choose the comfort of consensus over the agony of awareness. And so, the more clearly one sees, the more alone one becomes. It is a paradox, both deeply human and deeply tragic, that what could unite us, truth, so often divides us. Because truth is not gentle, it does not flatter, it calls us to reckon with the limits of our understanding and the fragility of our constructions. Most people are not ready to make that journey. They settle instead for shared entertainment, shared beliefs, shared routines, anything but shared insight. This is why deep thought often leads not to connection, but to isolation. Not because the thinker chooses solitude for its own sake, but because they find themselves surrounded by a language that no longer holds meaning. They speak not in riddles, but in clarity, and yet clarity sounds strange in a world addicted to noise. We live in a time where speed is mistaken for progress, where data is mistaken for wisdom, and where popularity is mistaken for truth. The one who pauses, who reflects, who refuses to conform for the sake of belonging is often seen as difficult, or worse, irrelevant. And here lies the real weight of intelligence, not in its brilliance, but in its burden. To know what is broken and to have no power to fix it, to see the machinery of the human condition, the repetition of fear, of self-deception, of hollow rituals, and to feel, day after day, that this vision has made you an outsider to the very species you long to understand. This loneliness is not dramatic. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It creeps in during conversations that never go beyond the surface. It lingers when you laugh at jokes that don't move you. It sharpens when you sit in rooms full of people and still feel invisible. And yet, you keep observing, not out of superiority, but because your very being demands it. You are driven not by arrogance, but by the ache for meaning, the desire to live authentically, even if that means walking alone. What makes this burden heavier still is the realization that even those you love may not wish to walk with you there. They may turn away, not in anger, but in fear, not because they dislike you, but because they cannot bear what you see. And yet, this clarity is also a kind of devotion, a devotion to what is real. To seek truth, knowing it will separate you from comfort, is one of the most courageous acts a human being can perform. It is a form of love, the rarest kind love for what is, without illusion. But love, if it is to endure, must also learn to live with the silence that surrounds it. There is a peculiar discomfort that arises when someone dares to speak what others silently fear to feel. In a world that thrives on emotional ease and conceptual simplicity, the one who questions the very structure of our desires, our goals, our definitions of success and happiness, becomes not a sage, but a threat. Society does not hate intelligence as an abstract concept. On the contrary, it celebrates a narrow kind of cleverness, the ability to optimize, to achieve, to perform. But it quietly resents the person who steps outside of this machinery and asks, what are we actually moving toward? And why that person is not applauded, but avoided. Because to question success is to threaten those who have invested their entire identity in chasing it. To question happiness is to expose the fragile scaffolding of countless lives built on imitation rather than reflection. And nothing disturbs the collective more than an individual who insists on truth over comfort. This is not a matter of intellectual arrogance. The truly thoughtful do not speak to shame or impress. They speak because remaining silent would be a kind of betrayal. But their honesty ruptures the smooth fabric of social life, which depends not on insight, but on agreement. Harmony in this system is achieved not by depth, but by repetition. And so, the intelligent person, especially one driven by conscience, finds themselves misunderstood, not because their thoughts are incoherent, but because they do not conform to the emotional logic of the group. When someone says, "Maybe what we've been calling happiness is merely distraction," it does not matter how gently they speak. Their words land like lightning, setting off a storm the crowd was desperate to avoid. We are conditioned, from early on, to obey the narrative. That life is linear, that meaning comes from achievement, that fulfillment is found in consumption, affirmation, approval. Anyone who disrupts this with a deeper reflection is seen, instinctively, as a saboteur, not because they are unkind, but because they are unwilling to pretend. This unwillingness makes them deeply human and profoundly isolated. In our society, there is a subtle form of punishment reserved for those who think too much and feel too deeply. It does not wear the face of violence. It appears instead in the form of polite dismissal, social exclusion, the quiet rebuke of indifference. One does not need to be silenced outright to be made invisible. It is enough to be treated as too much, too intense, too serious, too abstract. And so, over time, the thinker begins to sense that their presence destabilizes the room, not by choice, but by nature. Their way of seeing things more layered, more uncertain, more willing to embrace paradox becomes incompatible with a culture obsessed with certainty and clarity. Their inner world becomes a burden they carry alone. Yet this burden is not simply theirs, it is one they carry for all of us, because the questions they ask about meaning, about purpose, about truth, are not personal eccentricities. They are the very questions we avoid at the cost of our own vitality. To ignore them is to numb ourselves. To face them is to awaken, painfully, but authentically. The tragedy is that, rather than thanking the ones who bring these questions into the light, we often treat them as outcasts. We mistake their courage for disruption, their depth for arrogance, their sincerity for provocation. But beneath this reaction lies fear, not of the thinker, but of what their words might awaken in us. And so society, in its effort to protect itself from discomfort, drives its most sensitive minds to the margins. It does not burn them at the stake, but it leaves them out in the cold. It gives them silence instead of dialogue, exile instead of companionship. But the soul cannot live on exile alone, and the one who thinks not to dominate, but to connect longs still for a world that is willing to meet them halfway. It is one of the most tragic misunderstandings in our culture to see the thoughtful, the introspective, the deeply intelligent as aloof or arrogant. The truth, however, is much softer, more human, and far more painful. The person who sees deeply does not isolate themselves out of superiority, they withdraw out of sorrow, because contrary to what many assume, the intelligent long for connection. They ache to be known, not just for what they say, but for what they see to be mirrored by another soul that can hear not only their words, but the longing beneath them. It is not recognition they crave, but resonance, a moment of shared reality, free from distortion or pretense. But again and again, they find that their attempts to connect fall short. The world does not make space for slow questions, for honest complexity. Instead, it rewards brevity, brightness, ease, and so, the intelligent, those whose minds roam in wider, deeper spaces, are forced to compress, to simplify, to translate their thoughts into a language that does not fit them. This translation is not just linguistic, it is existential. They must pretend not to see what they see, must conceal nuance beneath clarity, must offer their insights like candies instead of invitations to wrestle with truth. This repeated distortion becomes a subtle violence. It doesn't break the body, it erodes the spirit. What begins as the hope for communion gradually dissolves into a reluctant silence. Over time, they stop offering their truth, not because they no longer care, but because the pain of being consistently misunderstood outweighs the joy of being occasionally heard, and so they choose quiet. But it is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of fatigue, the exhaustion of trying to connect in a world that listens only on its own terms. The silence they carry is not empty. It is full of words never spoken, ideas never shared, depths never welcomed. This kind of retreat is so easily mistaken for pride. But if we look closer, we find not arrogance but injury. Every dismissed thought, every awkward silence after a sincere offering, every moment when the room turns away instead of toward these are not minor slights. They are wounds. And each one says the same thing: you do not belong here. Not like that. Not as you are. Imagine carrying that message day after day, in every room, every conversation, every encounter, where your most authentic self must be tucked away for the sake of being tolerated. Eventually, you stop trying, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet grief. This grief is often invisible. It hides behind the gentle smile, the withdrawn gaze, the silence mistaken for indifference. But within, it is very much alive, a sorrow born not of solitude itself, but of the kind of solitude that follows failed connection. A solitude not chosen freely, but chosen out of necessity. Yet even in this retreat, something in the intelligent person remains awake. There is still a longing, however faint, that maybe there exists another voice out there, one that will not ask them to shrink, to soften, to dilute, one that will not be threatened by depth or frightened by sincerity. And that hope, however dim, is what keeps them human. We are taught to believe that understanding leads to peace, that if we can only comprehend the world, its pain will lessen, its contradictions will resolve, its chaos will somehow become coherent. But real understanding, the kind born not from reading or reasoning alone, but from seeing, does not bring comfort. It brings clarity, and clarity, when it strips away illusion, is rarely soothing. To understand deeply is to witness, over and over again, the same human cycle desire chased with desperation, fulfilled with illusion, followed by disappointment only to start again. This is not just a behavioral pattern. It is a spiritual wound, and when the mind perceives it clearly, when one no longer distracts oneself with dreams of final happiness or permanent certainty, a quiet disorientation begins to set in. The world starts to look strange. What others celebrate the chase, the accumulation, the applause begins to feel hollow. What is labeled as success becomes indistinguishable from surrender to a script no one remembers writing. The rewards of life no longer seduce because you see them for what they are, tools to manage behavior, not to nourish the soul. Happiness itself, that great ideal we've been taught to worship, reveals its constructed nature. You begin to see that much of what people call happiness is not joy, but relief from discomfort, from loneliness, from the unbearable weight of meaninglessness. It is a momentary forgetting, a brief numbing, not a rooted state of being. And morality, once held up as a beacon of universal order, begins to crack under scrutiny. You see that it is shaped by the needs of the culture that invented it, not by any eternal truth. What is good is often simply what is convenient, what keeps the machinery of society running smoothly, even if it runs over souls along the way. This kind of vision isolates, not because it alienates others, but because it removes the veil. You see the stage and the actors and the props, and the fact that no one seems to realize it's a play becomes the most painful part. You walk through the same streets, sit at the same tables, speak the same language, and yet everything feels unreal. It is as though you are awake in a world that insists on sleeping. And no matter how gently you try to whisper the truth, the response is always the same: turn down the light. It's too bright to bear. So you dim your voice, not because you doubt your vision, but because you begin to see how alone you are in it. And this loneliness is not social. It is ontological. It is the feeling of standing outside the structure of shared belief, of watching people cling to illusions you can no longer reach. You are not better than them, but you are no longer able to be like them. That is the cost. Not pride, not detachment, but the ache of exile, the exile of having seen too clearly, too soon. There is a cruel truth that often goes unspoken, not because it lacks evidence, but because it is too uncomfortable to accept. People rarely resent their own ignorance. They resent the one who forces them to confront it. The presence of genuine intelligence does not provoke admiration in the way we are led to believe. Instead, it often invites resistance, even hostility. Why? Because the intelligent individual, often without intention, becomes a mirror. And not just any mirror, one that reflects back the mental laziness, the unexamined beliefs, the carefully constructed illusions that most people have built their emotional survival upon. This reflection is not violent, not loud. It arrives quietly through a question too honest, a thought too precise, a silence that demands more than small talk. And yet its effect is profound. It disturbs, it agitates, it awakens a discomfort that many would rather suppress than explore. A strong person may make us feel weak. A wealthy person may make us feel poor. But the intelligent person, they make us feel mentally inadequate. And for the average person, that wound cuts deepest. Because intelligence is not something you can borrow, imitate, or fake. It reveals itself not in words alone, but in how one sees, questions, and lives. And nothing threatens the ego more than a truth it cannot defend. In this sense, intelligence does not just challenge what people think. It challenges that they think, or rather, that they do not. It exposes the passive acceptance of norms, the mechanical repetition of ideas, the shallow contentment with surface-level living. And when this is reflected back to someone who has never been taught to tolerate inner conflict, the result is almost always the same defensiveness. That defensiveness can take many forms. Sometimes it looks like ridicule. The intelligent person is called too serious, too intense, or too complicated. Sometimes it's avoidance conversation shift. The subject changes. The thinker is subtly excluded. And sometimes it takes the form of passive hostility, the rolling eyes, the polite silence, the sense that what has been said is somehow inappropriate simply because it disrupts comfort. But none of this means the intelligent person is wrong. Quite the opposite. What it means is that they are revealing something others would rather not see. They are breaking an unconscious agreement. Don't go too deep. Don't ask what keeps us safe. Don't speak what could make us feel ashamed. And so, the thinker becomes isolated not by their own design, but by their effect. Not because they withdraw first, but because they are gradually pushed out not with cruelty, but with consistent misalignment. Their very presence becomes inconvenient. This is the hidden burden of awareness. Not just seeing the truth, but watching how that truth alienates you from the very people you long to reach. It is a strange exile to be cast out, not for breaking the rules of society, but for understanding them too well. And yet, to stop thinking would be a betrayal of the self. Because once the mirror is polished, once the layers have been peeled back, the mind cannot unsee. It cannot return to the fog. And so, the intelligent person remains not above others, not against them, but inevitably apart. Throughout history, those who dared to think beyond the permitted boundaries were not celebrated, they were silenced. Their crime was not violence or treason, but clarity. Galileo did not wage war. He observed the cosmos and told the truth. And for that, he was condemned. Socrates did not rebel with weapons. He asked questions that peeled away the comfortable myths of his society. And for that, he was sentenced to death. The reason these thinkers were punished was not because they were wrong, but because they disrupted the emotional equilibrium of the masses. Their insights did not merely contradict doctrines, they unsettled the very sense of safety that people had built through blind repetition and inherited beliefs. And when a society feels threatened in its core assumptions, it does not argue, it expels. This pattern has not changed. We may no longer imprison philosophers in stone cells, but we still exile them in more subtle, insidious ways. Today, the punishment for thinking deeply is not a formal sentence. It is the dead air after you speak something too honest. It is the quick glance between others as they search for a safer topic. It is the invitation that never comes again. It is the warmth that vanishes when your presence becomes too reflective, too revealing, too real. We live in a time of apparent freedom where every opinion has a platform. But not all thoughts are welcome, especially not those that unsettle. The society that encourages self-expression often means only the expression of what can be consumed easily. If your words do not fit into a meme, a slogan, or a marketable identity, they float awkwardly, and you, along with them, become the stranger in the room. And it goes deeper than social discomfort. The thinker is punished because they break the spell. Most people are not looking for truth, they are looking for comfort. They want validation, not confrontation. So when you speak with honesty, not to attack, but to reveal, you threaten the scaffolding of denial that holds so many lives upright. The result is a quiet form of exile. You are not shouted down. You are not debated. You are simply not heard. Or worse, you are heard and quietly erased. But the damage doesn't only go one way. The one who thinks, the one who sees too much, also suffers because they do not think to dominate. They think because they care. Their questions arise not from superiority, but from love, a desire to understand what is real, to connect with others in that truth, and to find that their depth is not welcomed, not even tolerated, creates not just frustration, but a kind of grief. That grief grows in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of disconnection. The sense that no matter how gently you speak, your voice falls into a void. That you are speaking from a place no one else is willing to visit. And slowly, you begin to lose hope that such a place could ever be shared. This is the cost of independent thought in a society addicted to sameness. The punishment is not always public, it is personal. It is the distance that grows between the thinker and the world. It is the pain of being present, but unseen, engaged, but unmet. And yet, even in this exile, something endures. The one who sees cannot pretend not to. And so they keep walking, not because they are proud, but because turning back would mean betraying the very thing that makes them human, the hunger for truth, and the courage to keep seeking it, even in silence. The journey into solitude does not begin with contempt. It begins with hope, a quiet, earnest hope that there exists a place in this world where one can be seen, heard, and understood without having to distort the essence of who they are. The intelligent, the sensitive, the deeply reflective, they do not enter the conversation to dominate or to impress. They enter it with open hands, longing to connect through truth. But what they often find is not connection, but collapse. Their sincerity is met with discomfort, their questions with deflection, their insights with silence, and not because they are wrong, but because the world is not prepared to meet them where they stand. A society shaped by superficial engagement cannot hold the weight of real presence. And so, slowly, the one who hoped for dialogue begins to retreat, not in arrogance, but in exhaustion. There comes a point when the cost of showing up authentically becomes too high, when the effort to make oneself digestible, to shrink one's depth into something palatable, becomes unbearable. Every misunderstood sentence, every glazed-over gaze, every shallow response to something sacred chips away at the desire to try again. And so, they step back. Not because they feel superior, but because they feel worn down by the repeated failure to be met with honesty. The world, so loud with noise, leaves no space for stillness. And yet the soul of the thinker needs stillness not for escape, but for survival. This retreat is not a withdrawal from others. It is a return to oneself. It is the last safe place, a kind of internal refuge where one does not have to explain or defend their perception, where silence is not emptiness, but sanctuary. Here, the thinker is no longer performing. They are simply being. And while this solitude may look from the outside like isolation, on the inside, it feels like the only ground that hasn't eroded beneath their feet. Still, this kind of solitude carries its own ache. It is not chosen freely, but built out of necessity. It is not joyfully embraced, but quietly accepted. Like a wounded animal that finds a hidden corner not to die in, but to breathe in the thinker's solitude is not rejection, but healing. And yet, even in this sanctuary, the human heart continues to beat. It continues to hope, even against its own resignation. Because no matter how self-sufficient the mind becomes, the soul still longs for communion, a real communion, one that does not require masks or compromise. The pain is not in being alone. The pain is in having tried to be known and found that the world recoils from what is real. So, the intelligent person remains in the quiet, not because they have stopped caring, but because they have cared so deeply, so often, without ever being fully received. They do not close the door. Out of pride, they simply stop knocking. Yet even in this silence, there is still something soft inside them that listens for footsteps. Not many, just one. One presence willing to sit with them in the truth, without needing to change it, reduce it, or escape it. There is a point at which silence ceases to be sanctuary and becomes a cage. The mind, once seeking solitude as a refuge, begins to echo inwards, trapped within its own corridors. Without meaningful exchange, thought becomes recursive looping, tightening, suffocating. What once felt like depth starts to feel like drowning. The tragedy is not in the act of thinking. Thought, in its purest form, is liberation. It is the means by which we transcend habit, question illusion, and approach truth. But thinking cannot live in a vacuum. It needs friction. It needs contrast. It needs the unpredictable presence of another mind to sharpen it, to balance it, to break it open again and again. When no such presence arrives, the inner world becomes both too loud and too closed. You find yourself turning over the same ideas, not to develop them, but because you have nowhere else to go. The mind, left alone too long, begins to consume itself. What began as protection becomes pathology. Intelligence, which once gave you vision, now isolates you in a private theater with no audience. Every thought is acted out, examined, and dissected, but never met. And in that absence of recognition, something essential starts to erode. First, you question the world, its values, its priorities, its distractions. But soon, that questioning turns inward. You begin to doubt your perceptions, your clarity, your very worth. Without feedback, without response, without the anchoring presence of shared understanding, your thoughts lose gravity. They float freely, too freely, until even reality begins to blur. You start to ask whether anything has meaning, whether your pursuit of truth was noble or merely naive, whether your solitude was strength or a form of retreat you now cannot escape. And slowly, meaning, which once guided you like a distant light, begins to flicker. This is the hidden cost of isolation, not the absence of people, but the absence of dialogue. We are not meant to think alone forever, not because we are weak, but because we are relational beings shaped not only by our thoughts, but by the way they are held, challenged, and expanded in the presence of others. Without that presence, even the most lucid mind can begin to fracture. It loses proportion, it forgets where it began. It becomes a maze with no exit, only mirrors reflecting the same questions, over and over, without reply. What was once clarity becomes obsession. What was once courage becomes despair. What was once truth becomes unbearable in its solitude. And this is where many thinkers fall into the quiet despair that no one sees because they never scream. They disappear slowly, thought by thought, question by question, silence by silence. Not because they lacked wisdom, but because wisdom without witness can turn into torment. When a person begins to see through the illusions that others depend upon when they step beyond the comforting lies and habitual dreams of the crowd, a natural question arises: what now? What do I do when I see clearly, but no one else seems willing to look? This is not a question of pride. It is not the lament of someone who believes themselves better than others. It is the quiet ache of one who has lost the sense of belonging, not because they wish to leave, but because they refuse to lie to themselves. And the answer, though simple in words, is profound in experience. We learn to embrace our solitude not as a punishment, but as a path. For only in solitude does the thinker regain their freedom. Only there, away from the noise of conformity and the expectations of superficial belonging, does the soul begin to breathe deeply again. We do not need to be understood by everyone. In fact, to be understood by everyone often requires a betrayal of our truest selves. What we need is not universal agreement, but fidelity to our own voice, and the courage to stay with it, even when it is met with silence. You do not need to become shallow to be accepted. You are not obligated to bend your insight into a form that others find palatable. Your task is not to please, but to remain real, to protect the integrity of your perception, and to use it, not to isolate yourself in bitterness, but to serve something greater than your own comfort. Write not to be liked, but to give shape to what you see. Create, not for applause, but because creation is a form of love. Observe, not to judge, but to remain awake, and seek connection not with the many, but with the meaningful, not with noise, but with the eternal. There are others like you. You may never meet most of them, but they exist reading quietly, walking through crowded streets with eyes full of questions, speaking little, but feeling deeply. And in this invisible web of awakened souls scattered across the world, there is a quiet solidarity. If you have felt alone in your way of seeing, understand this is not a flaw. It is a sign that you have not turned away from reality. It means you are still alive to what matters. To see the truth in a world addicted to lies will always feel like exile. But exile is not the end. It is the beginning of a different kind of belonging, not to a crowd, but to a purpose. Not to a tribe, but to the timeless work of keeping human thought, human conscience, and human courage alive. And if the world has made you feel that it has no place for the thinker, for the questioner, for the one who does not fit, remember this. In a world of illusions, the one who sees clearly will always be the outsider, but they are also the ones who live most truthfully. And perhaps that is enough, more than enough. If you've stayed with us all the way to the end, chances are you're one of the few who walk this quiet, often lonely path, the path of those who refuse to live inside illusions, of those who see the world not just with their eyes, but with a heart that keeps asking deeper questions. The isolation that comes with intelligence is not a failure. It's a sign of awakening. And if you've ever felt like an outsider, if you've ever gone silent in a loud room, or tucked away your thoughts because no one seemed ready to hear them know this, you are not alone. Here, in this space, we find one another through the things we don't always have the words to say. So, please subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone you know who's carrying a world inside them too. And if something in this resonated with you, leave a comment, share a thought, an experience, or simply let us know you're here. Sometimes just a few honest words can light up someone else's day in ways we don't always see. And if this spoke to you, don't stop here. The next video is a vital part of this journey. Go watch it. Because maybe, just maybe, it will help you face the very thing you haven't yet had the courage to confront, but have always quietly felt